A new idea is the Indoor Village. This project is partially funded by CARES Act money from the city, along with money from Hennepin County and the state of Minnesota.
There is a warehouse in Minneapolis that used to print newspapers. For years after the presses stopped running, it just sat there. Windows boarded, concrete floor cracked in places, the kind of building you'd drive past 100 times without ever really seeing it. 2 blocks away, in the middle of a Minnesota winter, people were sleeping in doorways, under bridges, in cars with the engine running, just to keep the heat on until the gas ran out. But in the winter of 2020, a company called Pallet got a phone call. Within months, that same warehouse held 100 private rooms. Each one had a locking door, insulated walls, and its own little painted street sign out front, because the people who designed it wanted it to feel less like a shelter and more like a neighborhood. This is the story of how that happened, and why the people who built it understood something most shelters get wrong: what it actually feels like to not have a door you can close. To understand why this warehouse project worked, you have to go back to a couple in Everett, Washington, named Amy and Brady King. Before any of this, they spent about 2 decades building and remodeling homes. Regular contractor work, kitchens, additions, the kind of jobs that pay the bills but don't exactly change the world. But Amy had a connection to this issue that went deeper than most people in construction. She had lived it herself. Homelessness, addiction, the kind of years that don't show up on a resume but shape everything about how you see the world afterward. She got sober, rebuilt her life, and kept thinking about the people she used to know who never got that chance. Not because they didn't want to, because the systems meant to help them were slow and cold, and sometimes just didn't exist at all. Around 2016, she and Brady started asking a question that almost nobody in the housing industry was asking. What if you could give someone a safe, lockable, weatherproof space to sleep tonight? Not in 6 months after a grant gets approved, not after a shelter bed frees up, but tonight. And what if building that space didn't take a construction crew, a permit process that drags on for a year, and a few $100,000 per unit? Out of that question, they built Pallet. Think of something between a garden shed and a studio apartment, 64 square feet in the smallest version, insulated walls that hold heat through freezing nights, a door that locks from the inside, which sounds like a small detail until you remember that for someone sleeping outside, having zero privacy and zero security is one of the most exhausting parts of the whole experience. 2 people can assemble one of these units in under an hour. No crane, no foundation poured weeks in advance. A city, or a nonprofit, can go from an empty lot to 40 occupied shelters in a single weekend. There's also an engineering problem hiding inside all of this. A traditional home takes months to design around a climate. You need to know how cold it gets, how much snow the roof has to hold, how the insulation performs when the temperature swings 40 degrees between noon and midnight. Pallet's team had to solve all of that in a box that could be flat-packed, moved on a standard trailer, and still keep a person warm and dry through an actual Pacific Northwest storm or a Midwest deep freeze. The panels are built with rigid foam insulation sandwiched inside the walls, the same basic idea used in commercial freezers, just working in reverse to hold heat in instead of keeping it out. Small details, a raised floor to keep moisture from seeping up, a door frame that actually seals instead of just closing, ended up mattering as much as anything else in the design. But the detail that made this company different from every other shelter manufacturer wasn't the design. It was who built it. Amy and Brady made a decision early on that a lot of business advisors probably told them was risky. They started hiring people who had experienced homelessness, addiction, or incarceration themselves, not as a token gesture, but as the core of their workforce. By the time their factory was running at full capacity, most of their employees fit that description, earning a real wage, building the exact kind of shelter that had once been the thing standing between them and a safe night's sleep. Picture that for a second. A man who spent 2 winters sleeping in a tent under an overpass is now on an assembly line, measuring insulation panels for a unit that's going to keep somebody else warm next week. That's not a marketing story someone made up for a brochure. That's the actual staffing model. And it changes the way you build something when the people building it know exactly what's riding on getting the details right. So that's the company. Now here's how it ended up filling a warehouse in Minneapolis. By the winter of 2020, Minneapolis was dealing with a homelessness crisis that had gotten dramatically worse. Encampments were growing along the Mississippi River. Traditional shelters were at capacity, and some people who had been offered shelter beds turned them down anyway. Because a lot of shelters require you to line up outside, pack up all your belongings every single morning, and leave whether you have somewhere to go or not. For someone dealing with mental illness, substance use, or just deep exhaustion from years on the street, that revolving door isn't much better than staying outside. That's when Avivo stepped in. The Minneapolis nonprofit had spent decades running addiction treatment and workforce programs, and this time they wanted something different. Instead of another traditional shelter with rows of cots in an open room, they wanted something that felt like an actual place to live, even if it was temporary. They found that old publishing warehouse in the North Loop neighborhood, a huge open building with high ceilings and good bones, and they called Pallet. What happened next is the part that's actually kind of remarkable to picture. Inside that warehouse, crews built out an entire indoor village, 100 individual units, arranged in rows like actual streets, painted in different colors, blue, green, yellow, gray, so that each section felt like its own little neighborhood instead of one giant anonymous room. They gave the walkways names. People could find their way home the same way you'd find your way around any small town, by landmarks and street names, not by a bed number on a clipboard. Each unit had room for a bed, some personal storage, and enough space that a person could sit inside their own four walls and just exist for a minute without an audience. The building stayed open around the clock, so nobody had to pack up and leave at sunrise with nowhere to go until the shelter reopened that night. And the program took what's called a harm reduction approach, meaning people weren't turned away just because they were struggling with substance use in that moment. The goal was to get people stabilized first, and worry about everything else once they had a door that locked and a reason to trust the people around them. It opened in the dead of winter, which matters more than it might sound. In Minnesota, temperatures below freezing aren't a minor inconvenience. They're a genuine threat to life. Hypothermia can set in fast, and every year, people die outside in weather like that. So when Avivo Village opened its doors, it wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was, for 100 people at a time, the difference between a survivable night and a dangerous one. Try to picture what that first night actually looked like for someone walking in. You've maybe been sleeping in your car for weeks, or under an overpass, or bouncing between a friend's couch and a doorway downtown. Someone hands you a key, an actual key, to an actual room with your name on it, on a street with a name, in a building that isn't going anywhere. You close the door. For the first time in longer than you can remember, nobody can walk in on you. Nobody can take what little you have while you sleep. You can just breathe. That's not something you can measure on a spreadsheet, but it's the entire point of the design. Staff who worked there in the early months describe a rhythm settling in that surprised even them. People started decorating their units, a string of lights here, a photo taped to the wall there, small things that only make sense if you actually believe you're allowed to stay somewhere. A woman who had been living out of her car for the better part of a year got a unit near one end of the building, and the first thing she did was arrange her belongings on a shelf by size, the same way she used to organize her kitchen back when she had one. A man in his 50s who hadn't slept indoors in almost 2 years told a caseworker that the strangest part wasn't the bed or the heat, it was the quiet. No cars, no sirens, no wondering if someone was going to go through his bag while he slept. Just quiet, for the first time in longer than he could remember. Case managers were on site every day, not just to check boxes, but to actually sit with people and work through what came next. For some residents, that meant untangling old paperwork that had piled up for years, lost IDs, expired documents, the kind of bureaucratic mess that quietly keeps people stuck in place long after they're ready to move forward. For others, it meant connecting with a treatment program they'd been avoiding out of fear of being judged, or turned away, or forced to start over from zero. The building gave people a stable enough floor to stand on that they could finally deal with everything else. Now, the numbers do matter too, because good intentions alone don't keep a program funded or convince the next city to try this. In the years since it opened, Avivo Village has supported well over 800 people who had nowhere else to go. Hundreds have moved from those temporary units into permanent housing of their own, apartments with leases, actual addresses, Staff at the site have reversed close to 250 overdoses, which is 250 moments where someone's life was on the edge, and there happened to be a trained person nearby with what they needed to intervene. Every one of those numbers is a person, not a statistic, and every one of them started with the same simple thing: a door that locked. Before we keep going, I want to mention something for a specific part of this audience, because it matters and I think it's easy to miss. If you or someone you love is a veteran who's close to losing housing or already has, there's a free resource I genuinely encourage you to check out. It's called The Veteran's Blueprint, and it covers a handful of practical, overlooked steps that can make a real difference in a situation like that. Some of what's in there touches on benefits and processes that platforms like this one restrict creators from getting too specific about on camera, so instead of trying to squeeze it into a video and risk it getting flagged or pulled down, we put the whole thing in a free guide. I'll leave the link in the description below this video. If this applies to you or to someone you know, it costs you nothing to take a look, and it might genuinely help. What happened in Minneapolis didn't stay in Minneapolis. Once other cities saw fast Pallet could go from an empty lot or an empty building to a functioning, dignified shelter community in a matter of weeks instead of years, the model started spreading fast. Shelter villages using this same basic approach have gone up in Washington State, California, Oregon, and beyond. Some are outdoors, arranged like small campuses with shared bathrooms and a community building in the middle. Some, like Minneapolis, are entirely indoors, which matters enormously in places where winter isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. And Pallet itself kept growing right alongside the need. What started as a small team in Washington turned into a real manufacturing operation, still largely staffed by people who once needed exactly what they now build. Some of those employees have gone on to become supervisors, running entire production lines. A few have used the stability of a steady paycheck and safe housing to reconnect with kids they'd lost touch with during the worst years of their addiction. One employee who used to sleep behind the very shipping containers his factory now sits near has talked about the strange, almost dizzying feeling of walking past that spot every morning on his way into a job that pays him to keep other people from having to sleep there too. That's the part of this story that sticks with people. It's not just that a warehouse got filled with shelters. It's that the whole thing runs on a loop of people who understand the problem firsthand, building the solution with their own hands, for people who are exactly where they used to be. Other cities have adapted the idea in their own way too. Some places have used empty parking lots next to churches, fenced them off, and filled them with rows of units around a shared kitchen and laundry area, essentially building a small campus from scratch in a matter of weeks. Other cities have looked at their own aging, half-empty commercial buildings, an old big-box store, a shuttered hotel, a warehouse just like the one in Minneapolis, and asked the same question: what if, instead of waiting years for a developer to figure out what to do with this space, we just filled it with people who need somewhere safe to be tonight? Not every attempt has gone smoothly. Some cities have run into pushback from neighbors worried about property values, or zoning boards that weren't built to approve something this unconventional this quickly. But the basic math keeps winning arguments even when the politics get messy, because a project that costs a few $1,000s per unit and takes weeks to open is simply hard to compete with when the alternative is years of planning and tens of millions of dollars for the same number of beds. Now, it would be a little dishonest to end this story like it's a fairy tale with the problem solved, because it isn't. Even the people running these programs will tell you that a shelter, no matter how well designed, is not the same thing as permanent housing. These units are meant to be a bridge, a stable place to land while someone works with a case manager toward an actual lease and an actual address. Cities have run into real obstacles trying to replicate this: zoning fights, neighbors pushing back on where a village gets placed, funding that has to be renewed year after year instead of guaranteed long-term. And homelessness itself is driven by things a shelter can't fix on its own: the cost of rent outpacing wages, a shortage of mental health and addiction treatment, a housing market that's short millions of units nationwide. So this isn't a story about a problem that got solved. It's a story about a smarter first step. About the difference between telling someone experiencing homelessness to wait for a system to eventually help them, versus handing them a key tonight and figuring the rest out from there. And it's worth saying plainly that not everyone who walks through those doors ends up in a permanent apartment 6 months later. Recovery isn't a straight line, and neither is finding stable housing in a market this tight. Some residents leave and come back. Some take a year or more to get to a lease of their own. The program doesn't pretend otherwise, and honestly, that honesty is part of what makes it trustworthy. Nobody involved is claiming to have cured homelessness with plywood and insulation. What they're claiming, and what the numbers back up, is that a warm, private, dignified place to land makes every single next step easier, from getting sober, to getting a job, to just getting enough sleep, to think clearly about tomorrow. What strikes me most, honestly, is how much of this traces back to two people who used to just remodel kitchens, and one woman's decision to turn her worst years into the reason she couldn't stop thinking about the people still living through them. That warehouse in Minneapolis didn't get filled with shelters because a government agency finally approved a big enough budget. It got filled because a handful of people who had actually been cold, actually been unseen, actually been treated like a problem instead of a person, decided that a locking door and 45 minutes of assembly time was something they could actually do something about right now. Sometimes the biggest change doesn't start with a massive plan. It starts with somebody looking at an empty building and refusing to let it stay empty, while people outside it have nowhere to go. And if you or a veteran in your life is in a rough spot right now, that free guide, The Veteran's Blueprint, is waiting in the description below. It costs nothing, and it might genuinely help. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.